Dungeon Reaper. A light novel by Bloodmoss. Chapter 11. Wheels of Fortune. The garage reeked of rust and oil, basically the battle wagon's perfume. Grim crouched in front of his trusty 1994 Geo Metro, inspecting the windshield. It wasn't so much cracked as aggressively shattered, like a spider had thrown a tantrum across the glass. "All right, battle wagon," he muttered, patting the mismatched red door. "Let's see if you've got one more fight in you." The car said nothing. Grim took that as encouragement. He tugged at the broken interior door handle. It immediately betrayed him. With a sigh that felt personal, Grim cranked down the manual window, his arm burning like he was auditioning for a workout video, and popped the latch from the outside. "You're talking to it again," Penny said, leaning against the doorway with a smirk that practically shouted amused superiority. Grim climbed out of the car, wiping his hands on his pants. "Someone has to. It's not like anyone else respects this engineering marvel." Penny snorted. "Marvel? Grim, it's a miracle that thing hasn't fallen apart into a pile of rust and bad decisions." "Miracle? No." Grim grabbed a wrench and popped the hood with a theatrical flourish. "This is my blood, sweat, and tears keeping her alive." "Well, mostly sweat. I tried to avoid the tears part." "Or maybe it's cursed," Tara chimed in, strolling in and twirling a dagger. She wrinkled her nose. "Because it sure smells cursed." "How dare you?" Grim gasped, clutching his chest like she'd insulted his honor. "This is a classic." "It's a death trap," Tara said flatly, leaning on the rear bumper. It groaned in protest. "Honestly, I'm impressed it hasn't killed you yet." Ignoring her, Grim plunged back into the engine, tools clinking. "You wouldn't understand. This car isn't just transportation, it's a legacy." "A legacy of bad life choices?" Penny asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," Grim snapped, tightening a bolt dramatically. "A legacy of perseverance. She's been through hell and back, and she's still kicking. Kind of like me." The car responded with an ominous clunk, and Tara burst out laughing. "Yeah, real inspiring, champ." Grim wiped his forehead with his sleeve, smearing grease across his face. "Laugh all you want, but the day this car gives up on me is the day I give up on life." "Whatever helps you sleep at night," Penny said, rolling her eyes. "Just don't expect me to ride in it. I like living." Once Penny stepped out of earshot, Tara leaned in with a smirk. "Keep track of the time tonight, genius. Don't need another bathroom incident." Grim groaned. "That wasn't my fault. I didn't feel the vibration until it was too late." "And you ended up stuck in a gas station bathroom stall all night," Tara said, clearly enjoying herself. "Hilarious for me. Not so much for you." "Thanks for reminding me," Grim muttered, fiddling with the engine. "I'm not making that mistake again." Penny's voice called back into the garage, and Tara straightened, her tone louder and more casual. "Just saying, Grim, if this thing kills you, I'm not taking responsibility." Grim smirked. "Noted." He slammed the hood shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, choked, and then roared to life with the ferocity of an angry lawnmower. "Yes!" Grim punched the air triumphantly. "I told you, she's got an immortal soul." The headlights flickered once, almost like a wink, before stabilizing. Penny popped her head back into the garage. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "You're calling that a win?" Grim leaned out the window, grinning like he'd just won a race. "A big win. The battle wagon rides again." The garage fell quiet as Grim's battle wagon sputtered and rumbled its way out onto the street, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust fumes and something resembling victory. "That guy's a walking disaster," Tara said, leaning against a support beam like she was born to look unimpressed. "Maybe," Penny replied, watching the car as it rattled off, the engine sounding one bad pothole away from eternal rest. "But he's our walking disaster." Tara raised an eyebrow. "That sounded awfully affectionate, boss. You sure you're not getting attached?" Penny whipped around, her cheeks just a shade pinker than before. "He's not a project. He's just Grim. And he's trying. That's more than I can say for most of the people who pass through here." Tara smirked like she'd already won this argument. If you say so. Just don't let him drive the guild into the ground with that tin can. Penny rolled her eyes. Potential. That's what I see in both of them. She crossed her arms, shifting gears before Tara could fire another snarky shot. And thanks to you, we've been able to unlock a lot more of it. Don't think I haven't noticed. Tara snorted. This is about my invaluable contribution, isn't it? Don't get mushy, boss. I'm not a fan of pep talks. Too bad. Penny grinned. In the last month, we've cleared 3 times as many dungeons as we usually do. Morale's never been higher, and the guild coffers, she let out a low whistle. We actually have coffers now. Enough for gear, repairs, and an advertising budget. Advertising? Tara's smirk widened. What's the plan? Flyers saying, join the scrappy underdogs and maybe don't die horribly? More professional than that. Posters. Maybe a promo video, Penny said, ignoring her. It could bring in new recruits, fresh blood. If it works, this could be the springboard Hollow Blade needs. Sounds fancy, Tara said, rolling her shoulders. Be sure to put my name in the fine print. Something like, made possible by 1 month of forced servitude from a bored C-rank mercenary. Penny smirked. 3 more days of that servitude, by the way. Yeah. Tara waved dismissively. Then I'm gone. Back to real work with real teams who know what they're doing. Sure, Penny said lightly. You keep telling yourself that. Tara froze, turning to face her. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, nothing, Penny said, all too casually. It's just that you've enjoyed yourself here more than you'd like to admit. Tara's expression flattened. Delusional. Penny tilted her head, pretending to think. Am I? You've been a mentor to the newbies, a push for the veterans, and dare I say it, a pretty decent teammate. Tara groaned, throwing up her hands. Stop it. If I throw up from all this positivity, it's your fault. Penny just smiled. We'll miss you when you leave. Not happening, Tara said, already walking away. 3 days, boss. That's all you're getting. After that, I'm done playing babysitter. Penny leaned against the doorframe, watching her go. We'll see. Tara paused at the threshold, flicking a dagger into its sheath. Good luck with your scrappy underdog dreams, Penny. You're gonna need it. Penny let out a small laugh as Tara left. Her gaze drifted to the empty street, where Grim and his ridiculous car had disappeared. Walking disaster, she murmured, almost fondly, before heading back inside. Grim slid the door open, stepping into the dojo and nearly losing his breath. The space stretched farther than he expected, polished wooden floors gleaming under the warm light of paper lanterns. A group of students moved in unison, their bodies a sharp contrast of precision and fluidity as they flowed through their katas. Each movement was punctuated by the rhythmic crack of wooden weapons striking invisible targets. At the far end of the room, perched on a raised platform, sat the man Grim assumed was Shihan Hoshizawa. Draped in black robes that hung like shadows, he sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees. His gaze swept over the students, and though he said nothing, the atmosphere seemed to tighten whenever his eyes moved. The students worked harder under that silent scrutiny, their forms sharper, their focus absolute. Grim leaned against the far wall, watching as the scene unfolded. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, the way every student moved like they were part of a single, unseen rhythm. His fingers tapped against his side, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. A sudden thought struck him. He lifted his arm, sniffing near his shoulder, and winced. The faint scent of grease and motor oil clung to him like a stubborn passenger, a souvenir from his earlier fight with the battle wagon's engine. Grim muttered under his breath. Great. I'm that guy now, the one who smells like a mechanic. The clack of wood filled the room as the students struck in perfect unison again, jolting him out of his self-consciousness. His gaze drifted back to the Shihan, who remained seated, as still as stone. Then Hoshizawa's eyes shifted. They landed on Grim, not a glance, but a deliberate movement, like the turning of a compass needle. Grim tensed under the weight of it, a subtle but undeniable pressure. It wasn't hostile, nor was it kind. It was watching, judging. Grim straightened instinctively, resisting the urge to fidget. His body remained still, but inside, 100 thoughts fought for space. Is this a test? Did I do something wrong? Can this guy smell me from all the way across the room? The Shihan's gaze lingered for what felt like an eternity, then moved away as quietly as it had arrived. Grim let out a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. Across the room, a few students glanced at him briefly before turning back to their forms. When the session ended, the students bowed in perfect unison, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you, Shihan," before stepping off the floor. Hoshizawa stood at last, his movements fluid and precise, every shift of his weight intentional. He turned toward Grim. "You," he said, his voice calm but impossibly steady. Grim froze mid-step. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but being singled out by this man made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The few remaining students paused in the doorway, stealing quick glances as though trying to figure out what had just happened. "Stay after," Hoshizawa continued. "I wish to speak with you." Grim nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to respond. As the students filed out, he followed Hoshizawa to a small room just off the main hall. The Shihan slid the door open and stepped inside, his movements as deliberate as ever. The room was simple, a wooden floor, a low table, and a single scroll on the wall, inked with calligraphy Grim couldn't begin to read. Hoshizawa gestured for Grim to enter, sliding the door shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, though Grim wasn't sure if it was from the room itself or the presence of the man standing across from him. Hoshizawa seated himself at the low table, gesturing for Grim to do the same. His movements were deliberate, as if even the act of sitting held a purpose. Grim lowered himself awkwardly onto the cushion across from the Shihan, his thin legs bending uncomfortably under the table. The silence stretched just long enough to make him fidget. "You came here," Hoshizawa began, his voice calm and measured, seeking training. Grim nodded. "Yeah, I want to get better. At fighting, I mean." The Shihan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Grim. "Fighting is not the same as mastery. What do you seek to master?" Grim hesitated. "A scythe," he said finally, his voice tinged with defiance. For the first time, Hoshizawa's expression shifted, just slightly. A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Hoshizawa tilted his head, his gaze sharpening. "The correct answer would have been yourself." Grim blinked, thrown by the statement. Before he could reply, the Shihan continued, his tone steady but firm. "A scythe," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue as though testing it. "You wish to take a tool of farming of harvest and wield it as a weapon in combat." Grim shrugged, leaning back slightly. "Well, yeah. Death uses one, doesn't he?" Hoshizawa's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, the air felt heavier. Grim stiffened, suddenly unsure if he'd said something wrong. "Death," Hoshizawa said softly, his tone unreadable. His eyes didn't leave Cain, staring through him as if attempting to pierce something unseen. The silence stretched, seeming heavy and deliberate. Hoshizawa studied Cain with unnerving stillness, his hands resting lightly on the table. To Cain, it felt like the Shihan was sizing him up the way a blacksmith might examine flawed steel. But there was something more to that gaze, a depth that unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. Unseen by Cain, tendrils of darkness stretched out from him, slow and deliberate, like fingers searching for purchase. They weren't wild or chaotic, but steady, almost methodical, weaving through the air and touching the room around them. One slid along the polished wood, curling up the leg of the low table between them, while another brushed faintly against the hem of Hoshizawa's robe. The Shihan stiffened at the touch, though his expression remained carefully neutral. This aura was unlike anything he'd encountered before. In his years of practice, he'd grown attuned to the subtle energies of people, the hues of a life built on choices, actions, and emotions. But this was something beyond life. The tendrils didn't pulse with the warmth of human decisions or emotional ties. They were cold, vast, and unbound, an echo of something far greater. Yet Cain sat there, utterly unaware, as though the weight of it didn't touch him at all. Another tendril stretched out, bolder than the rest, curling upward toward Hoshizawa's shoulder. The Shihan's breath caught, not visibly, but deep within, where his years of discipline couldn't entirely suppress the reaction. The cold presence of it was sharper this time, brushing against him like the edge of a blade. It wasn't the calculated fear of an opponent's attack, but something far more primal. Unaccustomed to the sensation, Hoshizawa stood abruptly, the quiet scrape of his robe against the floor the only sound as he moved. Without a word, he crossed to the weapon rack, his steps measured but purposeful. He ran his hand lightly over the handles, hesitating for just a moment before selecting one. Shihan Hoshizawa carefully returned to the table with the kusarigama in his hands. The wooden handle gleamed under the lantern light, its curved blade pristine, and the chain dangled from its base, ending in a weighted tip that swayed with each step. Hoshizawa placed it carefully on the table between them, his movements deliberate. "Then start here," he said, his voice calm and measured. Cain leaned forward, his curiosity piqued as he reached for the weapon. The chain slipped through his fingers as he tested its weight, surprised at its balance. "It's lighter than I thought," he said, giving the chain a hesitant swing. Hoshizawa didn't react to the clumsy gesture. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Cain, though his thoughts were divided. How could someone so utterly unaware of their nature carry an aura like this? The tendrils, though faint now, still lingered in his periphery, their dark presence coiled and waiting. "Mastery begins with intent," the Shihan said finally, leaning forward slightly, his tone lowering. "But intent without discipline is chaos." "I will teach you the principles," Cain rose. "The rest, you must find within yourself." Hoshizawa tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. "To master this weapon," he said, gesturing toward the kusarigama on the table, "requires more than practice. It demands discipline, stability, and clarity of purpose." "Do you have these?" Cain rose. Cain scratched the back of his head, his fingers brushing through unkempt hair. 2 out of 3? Maybe?" The Shihan's eyes lingered on him, his curiosity deepening. He couldn't reconcile the young man before him with the dark presence surrounding him. "You lack a foundation," Hoshizawa said simply. "That is clear." Cain shrugged, leaning back slightly. "Okay, so I'm not exactly stable. It's not easy focusing on balance when your bed's also your driver's seat." Hoshizawa's gaze flickered downward, watching as one of the tendrils stretched lazily toward the edge of the room, as though the shadows themselves were listening. "Your arrangements are insufficient," he said, his tone softer, but no less firm. Cain raised an eyebrow. "You been spying on me or something? You know my name and my ride? You smell of oil and exhaustion. Added to the fact you have been posting cool stick, bro, on various videos of the dojo on the internet." Hoshizawa replied, his voice calm. "I do not need to spy." Cain opened his mouth to retort, but stopped, muttering instead, "Fair enough." The Shihan straightened slightly, his focus returning to the weapon on the table. The blade glinted in the lantern light, but his thoughts were elsewhere. How could someone so unaware of their own nature carry an aura like this? "There is space here," Hoshizawa said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "A small room in the back of the dojo. It is not luxurious, but it will suffice. Train here. Live here. Dedicate yourself fully." Cain blinked. "Wait, are you serious? You're offering me, what, free rent? What's the catch?" "No catch," the Shihan replied, his voice steady. "Only discipline. Focus. Mastery requires sacrifice, your comfort, your distractions. Set them aside, and I will guide you."